In the frozen forests of Finland, during one of the most brutal winters Europe had ever seen, a revolution in military tactics was being written in snow and ice. This is the story of how a small nation's marksmen forced one of the world's largest armies to completely rethink everything they knew about warfare. And in doing so, they created techniques that would change military doctrine for generations to come. November 30th, 1939. The temperature in Finland had already dropped to minus 40 degrees Celsius. Soviet forces, numbering over 450,000 men, crossed the Finnish border with overwhelming confidence. They had tanks, artillery, and aircraft. The Finns had roughly 200,000 defenders, outdated equipment, and something the Soviets hadn't counted on. They had the forest, the winter, and an intimate understanding of how to use both. The Soviet leadership expected the campaign to last perhaps 2 weeks. They had calculated everything: numbers, firepower, logistics. What they hadn't calculated was that they were about to face some of the most effective light infantry the world had ever seen. The Finnish army, and particularly their marksmen, were about to teach the Red Army lessons that would cost tens of thousands of lives before they were learned. The terrain of the Finnish-Soviet border was unlike any other battlefield in Europe. Endless forests of pine and spruce, broken by frozen lakes and marshland. Roads were few and far between. This wasn't terrain for tanks and massive formations. This was terrain for small units, for men who knew every tree and every shadow. The Finns had been hunting in these forests their entire lives. Now they would hunt something far more dangerous. The Soviet advance began with typical military doctrine of the era. Large columns moving along the few available roads, supported by armor and artillery. The problem was that the roads were predictable. They were channeled, and every single Finnish soldier knew exactly where those columns would have to pass. The Soviets quickly learned that in Finland, the forest itself was the enemy's greatest weapon. Finnish units, often numbering no more than a dozen men, would wait in positions they'd prepared days in advance. They wore white winter camouflage that rendered them nearly invisible against the snow. They moved on skis, allowing them to traverse terrain that would stop a column of trucks or tanks cold. And they were armed with rifles that, in the right hands, could reach out and touch someone at distances that seemed impossible. The most famous of these marksmen, though he would have rejected the fame, was a man named Simo Häyhä. Before the war, he'd been a farmer, a quiet man who enjoyed hunting and target shooting. When the war began, he was 34 years old, already considered somewhat old for frontline service, but Simo Häyhä wasn't going to be just any frontline soldier. Häyhä carried a Finnish M2830 rifle, a variant of the Mosin Nagant that had been modified and improved by Finnish armorers. Unlike many snipers of the era, he refused to use a telescopic sight. His reasoning was both practical and brilliant. A scope could fog in the extreme cold. It required the shooter to raise their head higher, creating a larger silhouette. And, most critically, the glass could catch and reflect even the faintest sunlight, revealing a position. Instead, Häyhä used iron sights. He would lie in the snow for hours, sometimes days, waiting for the perfect moment. He packed snow in front of his muzzle to prevent it from kicking up a cloud when he fired, which would give away his position. He kept snow in his mouth to prevent his breath from forming a visible vapor cloud in the frigid air. Every detail was considered, every movement calculated. The Soviet soldiers began to notice that their comrades would suddenly fall, with no sound of a shot, no muzzle flash, nothing to indicate where the threat had come from. One moment a man would be walking, the next he would collapse into the snow. The psychological effect was devastating. Soviet units began to bunch together for mutual protection, which only made them easier targets. They began to hesitate before moving across open ground. Morale plummeted. The Finnish marksmen weren't just effective because of their individual skill, though that skill was extraordinary. They were effective because they understood something fundamental about winter warfare that the Soviets, despite their own experience with harsh winters, had somehow overlooked. In the snow and ice, conventional tactics didn't just become less effective, they became actively dangerous. Soviet doctrine called for aggressive advances, for maintaining momentum, for overwhelming the enemy with superior numbers and firepower. But in the Finnish forests, momentum meant exposure. Numbers meant more targets, and firepower was useless if you couldn't see what you were shooting at. The Finns, outnumbered and outgunned, turned every one of those Soviet advantages into a liability. The technique that would eventually force the Soviets to completely rethink their approach came from a combination of necessity and innovation. Finnish marksmen discovered that the standard prone shooting position, lying flat on one's stomach, created several problems in deep snow. First, it required clearing a position, which took time and created visible disturbance. Second, the body's heat would melt the snow beneath it, creating a depression that would freeze overnight and mark the position for enemy observers. Third, and most critically, it limited the shooter's field of view in terrain covered by snowdrifts and low vegetation. So the Finns began to experiment with alternative positions. They would dig shallow scrapes in the snow, but instead of lying in them conventionally, they would position themselves at angles that seemed almost impossible. Some would lie on their sides, using the natural contours of the terrain for support. Others would brace themselves against trees or rocks in positions that allowed them to cover multiple approach routes while maintaining minimal exposure. The most revolutionary technique, the one that the Soviet soldiers would later describe as shooting upside down, involved using elevated positions in ways that violated every conventional rule of marksmanship. Finnish marksmen would climb into trees, but not in the obvious way that one might expect. They wouldn't position themselves sitting on a branch like a hunter in a deer stand. Instead, they would wedge themselves into the tree in inverted or sideways positions, using branches and the trunk for support, creating shooting platforms that were nearly impossible to spot from the ground. From these positions, they could engage targets at ranges and angles that seemed impossible. A Soviet soldier might take cover behind a log or in a depression, thinking himself safe from ground-level fire, only to be engaged from above and behind. The psychological impact was even more devastating than the physical casualties. Soviet troops began to fear not just what was in front of them, but what might be above them, beside them, anywhere in the three-dimensional environment of the forest. But perhaps even more innovative was the technique that would later be adopted and refined by Soviet marksmen themselves. Finnish snipers discovered that by positioning themselves in what appeared to be tactically disadvantageous positions, actually on the reverse slopes of hills or in slight depressions, they could use the terrain to their advantage in unexpected ways. From these positions, they would engage Soviet troops as they crested hills or moved through draws, catching them at moments of maximum vulnerability. The key was understanding sight lines and how they changed with terrain. A Soviet soldier, trained to worry about threats from elevated positions ahead, wouldn't think to worry about a position that was technically lower than his own location. But if that lower position had a clear sight line to where the Soviet soldier would have to pass, and if the Finnish marksman had calculated the geometry correctly, it became a perfect ambush position. These techniques required extraordinary marksmanship skills. Shooting from unconventional positions meant dealing with unusual body mechanics, different points of aim, and complex calculations of trajectory. The Finns had been training for this their entire lives, though they might not have realized it. Growing up in a culture where hunting was not just a sport, but a way of life, where every man learned to shoot in all conditions and from all positions, had created a generation of natural marksmen. The Soviet casualties mounted with terrifying speed. Entire companies would be reduced to fractions of their original strength without ever seeing the enemy. Soviet commanders began to refer to the Finnish marksmen as White Death, both for their camouflage and for the silent, invisible way they struck. Reports filtered back to Soviet High Command describing situations that seemed impossible. How could a single Finnish soldier pin down an entire Soviet company? How could dozens of men disappear into the forest and emerge behind Soviet lines to strike at supply columns? The answer was that the Finns weren't fighting a conventional war. They were fighting a war of mobility against a static enemy. While Soviet forces moved along predictable roads in predictable formations, Finnish ski troops would range across country that Soviet maps showed as impassable. They would strike, vanish, and strike again miles away hours later. And always, the marksmen would be there, picking off officers, communications personnel, and anyone who seemed to be organizing resistance. By January of 1940, Soviet losses had reached catastrophic proportions. Some estimates suggest that Soviet casualties were approaching 150,000 men, with Finnish losses at around 25,000. More importantly, entire Soviet divisions had been rendered combat ineffective, not through direct assault, but through the steady attrition of skilled marksman fire and small unit ambush tactics. It was at this point that the Soviet High Command began to take the problem seriously. Orders went out to all units to capture Finnish marksmen alive if possible, to recover their equipment, and most importantly, to document their tactics. Soviet intelligence officers began interviewing survivors, collecting reports, and attempting to understand exactly how the Finns were achieving their remarkable results. What they discovered forced them to confront some uncomfortable truth about their own military doctrine. The Soviet Army, despite its size and power, had been preparing to fight the last war, not this one. Their tactics were based on the massive, grinding battles of the First World War and the Russian Civil War. Mass infantry assaults, heavy artillery preparation, breakthrough by armor. These tactics worked well in open terrain against a conventional enemy. They were nearly useless in the Finnish forests. The reports from the front described Finnish tactics in detail. The unconventional shooting positions, the patience and fieldcraft, the intimate knowledge of terrain, the ability to move silently and invisibly through conditions that would stop a regular infantry unit cold. Soviet commanders realized that they needed to not just counter these tactics, but to adopt and adapt them. The first step was studying captured equipment. Finnish rifles were examined in detail. Soviet armorers noted the modifications the Finns had made to standard weapons. Trigger pulls were lighter and crisper for better accuracy. Sights were adjusted for the specific ballistics of Finnish-manufactured ammunition. Stocks were shaped to provide better ergonomics in heavy winter clothing. Every detail was cataloged, but more important than the equipment was the technique. Soviet marksmen were summoned from across the front and given unusual orders. They were to study, to experiment, to try positions and methods that would have gotten them laughed at in peacetime. Officers who had been trained in rigid, by-the-book tactics were ordered to think creatively, to consider the three-dimensional nature of forest warfare. Soviet soldiers began practicing shooting from positions they'd never considered before, lying on their sides, braced against trees, wedged into rock formations, even inverted positions, hanging from branches or supported by improvised harnesses. The goal was to understand what the Finns had discovered through generations of hunting experience. That the human body, properly trained and positioned, could deliver accurate fire from positions that seemed impossible. The results were remarkable. Soviet marksmen, many of whom had been skilled shooters to begin with, found that these unconventional positions actually improved their effectiveness in certain situations. Shooting from a side position, for example, presented a much smaller target to return fire, while still allowing for accurate shot placement. Elevated positions, even when the shooter was oriented at odd angles, provided visibility and fields of fire that were impossible from ground level. More importantly, these positions were unexpected. Just as the Finns had exploited Soviet expectations about where threats would come from, Soviet marksmen now began to exploit Finnish and later German expectations. A soldier taking cover from ground-level fire might not think to look up and to the side, where a Soviet sniper had wedged himself into a position that allowed engagement from an unexpected angle. The technique that Soviet marksmen developed, which they began to call complex position shooting, involved pre-scouting terrain and identifying positions that provided maximum advantage. Rather than simply lying prone behind cover, they would look for natural features that could support the body in unusual orientations. A fallen tree might allow a shooter to brace themselves in a semi-inverted position with a perfect sight line to a crucial choke point. A cluster of rocks might permit a sideways stance that was invisible from the front, but provided a clear shot to passing targets. Training protocols changed dramatically. Where Soviet marksman training had previously focused on accuracy from standard positions, it now emphasized adaptability and creativity. Trainees were given scenarios and terrain features and told to find the best possible position, regardless of how unconventional it might seem. Instructors who had themselves learned these techniques in combat began teaching the next generation. The impact on accuracy was significant. Soviet after-action reports from later in the war, particularly during operations against German forces, documented substantial improvements in marksman effectiveness. Soviet snipers who had been trained in these new techniques consistently achieved higher hit ratios than those using conventional methods. More importantly, their survival rates improved dramatically. By using unexpected positions and angles, they were harder to locate and counter. One of the key innovations was what Soviet marksmen began to call the inverted triangle. This was a tactical concept rather than a single position. Instead of thinking of engagement zones in 2 dimensions, as a flat plane, snipers were trained to think in 3 dimensions, as a volume of space. They would identify 3 positions around a target area, typically at different elevations and orientations, that formed a triangular pattern. By moving between these positions, or in some cases, having multiple marksmen occupy them simultaneously, they could cover the target area from multiple unexpected angles. This technique proved devastatingly effective in urban warfare, which became increasingly important as the war progressed. In cities and towns, the 3-dimensional environment was even more complex than in forests. Buildings provided countless opportunities for unconventional positions. Soviet marksmen would position themselves in basements, shooting upward through street-level grates. They would hang from the upper floors of buildings, supported by ropes or debris, shooting at steep downward angles. They would use damaged structures to create positions that seemed architecturally impossible but provided perfect fields of fire. The accuracy improvements were documented in training records. Soviet marksmen using conventional prone positions in training typically achieved hit ratios of around 60 to 70% at combat ranges of 300 to 500 meters. Those same marksmen, after training in complex position shooting, showed improvement to 85 to 90% accuracy. The difference was attributed to several factors. Unconventional positions often provided more stable shooting platforms than hastily prepared prone positions. They reduced the shooter's exposure to wind and weather. And perhaps most importantly, they allowed the shooter to remain calm and focused rather than worrying about return fire from expected directions. But it wasn't just about individual marksman skills. The Soviet Army began to integrate these lessons into broader tactical doctrine. Infantry units were trained to be aware of the 3-dimensional threat environment. Soldiers learned to check not just the obvious positions ahead of them, but to scan above, below, and to the sides. Officers began to position their units to defend against attacks from unexpected angles. The Finns, for their part, noticed the change in Soviet tactics as the Winter War progressed. Soviet units that had been easy targets in November and December became much more cautious and effective by February and March. Soviet counter-sniper efforts improved dramatically. Finnish marksmen began to face return fire from positions that showed clear evidence of creative thinking and adaptive tactics. The Soviets were learning. The Winter War ended in March 1940 with a peace treaty that ceded some Finnish territory to the Soviet Union, but left Finland independent. Both sides claimed victory, but the cost had been enormous. Soviet casualties far exceeded what had been anticipated for what was supposed to be a quick campaign. Finnish casualties, while proportionally smaller, had been devastating for such a small nation. But the real legacy of the Winter War wasn't in territorial changes or political outcomes. It was in the transformation of military tactics that had occurred. The Soviet army that emerged from Finland was not the same army that had entered. It had been forced to confront its weaknesses and adapt. The lessons learned about winter warfare, small unit tactics, and particularly marksman employment would serve the Soviets well in the coming years. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, they expected to face the same rigid, predictable Red Army that had struggled so badly in Finland. What they encountered instead was an army that had learned hard lessons. Soviet marksmen, trained in the techniques adapted from Finnish tactics, proved to be among the most effective in the world. They used unconventional positions, creative fieldcraft, and patient stalking techniques that extracted a heavy toll on German forces. Soviet sniper schools, which had been relatively informal affairs before Finland, became rigorous training programs. Students learned not just marksmanship, but fieldcraft, camouflage, psychological operations, and most importantly, adaptive tactics. They studied the Finnish campaign in detail, learning from both sides' successes and failures. The concept of fighting from unexpected positions, of using terrain in 3 dimensions rather than 2, became a cornerstone of Soviet sniper doctrine. Famous Soviet marksmen like Vasily Zaitsev, Lyudmila Pavlichenko, and dozens of others credited their effectiveness to training that had been developed directly from Finnish war lessons. Zaitsev, in particular, was known for using positions that confused and frustrated German counter-snipers. He would engage from locations that seemed tactically disadvantageous, using geometry and terrain features to create perfect ambush positions. The technique of what had been called shooting upside down evolved into a comprehensive system of unconventional engagement. Soviet training manuals began to include detailed diagrams showing various body positions and how they could be used in different terrain types. Instructors emphasized flexibility and adaptability over rigid adherence to standard positions. The goal was to create marksmen who could assess any situation and find the optimal position, regardless of how unusual it might appear. The accuracy improvements that resulted from these techniques were significant enough that they changed the calculus of infantry combat. German units learned to fear Soviet snipers with a respect that bordered on paranoia. Streets and open areas that should have been passable became death traps. German soldiers developed elaborate procedures for movement in sniper-threatened areas, but even these were often inadequate against marksmen who could engage from completely unexpected positions. One of the most notable examples of these techniques in action occurred during the Battle of Stalingrad. The ruined city provided ideal terrain for unconventional sniper positions. Soviet marksmen would position themselves in collapsed buildings, shooting through narrow gaps in rubble. They would hang from the undersides of damaged floors, supported by debris and rope, engaging German troops moving through the streets below. They would use the labyrinthine nature of the destroyed city to create overlapping fields of fire from positions that seemed to violate all normal tactical thinking. German after-action reports from Stalingrad consistently mentioned the difficulty of countering Soviet snipers. German counter-sniper teams, some of the best in the world, found themselves frustrated by opponents who refused to fight conventionally. Every time they believed they had located a Soviet position and prepared a counter shot, the Soviet marksman would engage from somewhere completely different. The Germans were fighting an enemy who had learned to think in 3 dimensions, and they were struggling to adapt. The psychological impact of these tactics extended far beyond the actual casualties inflicted. German soldiers in Stalingrad and other urban battles began to exhibit symptoms of extreme stress. They would hesitate to move through areas that should have been safe. They would fire at shadows and noises, wasting ammunition and revealing their positions. The constant awareness that death could come from any angle, at any moment, from an invisible enemy, wore down even veteran troops. Soviet doctrine evolved to integrate these lessons at all levels. Sniper schools produced thousands of trained marksmen who carried the knowledge of Finnish tactics into battles across Eastern Europe. But more importantly, the concept of adaptive three-dimensional thinking spread beyond just sniper units. Regular infantry soldiers were trained to think creatively about cover and concealment. Officers learned to position their units to defend against and exploit unexpected angles of attack. The post-war Soviet military invested heavily in studying and refining these techniques. Training films were produced showing correct and incorrect methods of position selection. Psychological research was conducted to understand why unconventional positions were so difficult for enemies to counter. The lessons learned in the Finnish forests became part of a comprehensive military doctrine that would influence Soviet and Russian military thinking for decades. Other nations took notice as well. British and American military observers who studied the Eastern Front campaigns noted the effectiveness of Soviet sniper tactics. Post-war, Western militaries began to incorporate similar training into their own marksman programs. The rigid, by-the-book approach that had characterized pre-war sniper doctrine gave way to more flexible, adaptive methods that emphasized creativity and terrain exploitation. The Finnish marksmen who had started this revolution largely returned to their farms and forests after the war. Men like Simo Heiha, who by war's end was credited with over 500 confirmed engagements, went back to quiet lives. Heiha spent his later years hunting and answering occasional questions from military historians. When asked about his techniques, he would simply say that he did what seemed natural for the conditions he faced. This humble response actually captured something profound about what had happened during the Winter War. The Finns hadn't set out to revolutionize military tactics. They had simply adapted their peacetime hunting skills to the reality of warfare in their native terrain. It was the Soviets, forced to learn or die, who had recognized the brilliance of these adapted techniques and systematized them into military doctrine. The concept of unconventional engagement positions spread beyond just sniping. Special operations forces around the world began training in what became known as adaptive shooting techniques. Military and law enforcement marksmen learned to engage targets from positions that maximize their advantage while minimizing their exposure. The rigid distinction between proper and improper shooting positions blurred as instructors emphasized effectiveness over form. Modern military doctrine owes a significant debt to those frozen Finnish forests. When current special operations snipers position themselves in ways that would have shocked pre-war marksmen, when they use terrain features and architectural elements to create impossible shot angles. When they think in 3 dimensions rather than 2, they are applying lessons that were learned in blood and snow more than 8 decades ago. The accuracy improvements that resulted from these techniques have been validated repeatedly in modern conflicts. Studies of sniper effectiveness in various theaters consistently show that marksmen who employ adaptive, terrain-exploiting positions achieve higher accuracy and survival rates than those using conventional methods. The difference is particularly pronounced in complex terrain, whether that's dense forest, urban environments, or mountainous regions. Training methodologies continue to evolve based on these principles. Modern sniper schools emphasize problem-solving and creativity over rote memorization of standard positions. Students are presented with complex terrain and tactical scenarios and challenged to find optimal engagement positions, regardless of how unconventional they might be. The goal is to develop adaptive thinking skills that can be applied to any situation. The technology has changed dramatically since 1939. Modern rifles are far more accurate than the weapons used in the Winter War. Optical sights have evolved from simple telescopes to sophisticated systems with ranging capabilities, ballistic computers, and thermal imaging. Communication systems allow snipers to coordinate with other units in ways that would have been impossible in Simo Häyhä's time. But the fundamental principles remain the same. Use terrain to your advantage. Think in 3 dimensions. Be unpredictable. Position yourself where the enemy doesn't expect you to be. These lessons, learned in the Finnish forests and refined through decades of subsequent combat experience, form the foundation of modern marksman doctrine. The story of how Finnish snipers taught the Soviets to fight upside down is ultimately a story about adaptation and learning. It's about how necessity drives innovation and how intelligent opponents force each other to evolve. The Finns, facing impossible odds, adapted their hunting traditions to create devastating military tactics. The Soviets, suffering catastrophic casualties, learned from their enemy and improved their own capabilities. The resulting synthesis created techniques that changed warfare. Perhaps the most important lesson isn't about any specific shooting position or tactic. It's about the willingness to question assumptions, to learn from adversity, and to adopt effective techniques regardless of where they come from or how unconventional they might seem. The Soviet military could have dismissed Finnish tactics as the desperate measures of an outmatched enemy. Instead, they studied them, learned from them, and incorporated them into their own doctrine. That intellectual flexibility, as much as any specific technique, was what allowed them to transform defeat into a learning opportunity. Today, military forces around the world train in techniques that trace their lineage back to those snowy Finnish forests. When a sniper positions himself in a way that would have seemed impossible or improper to a pre-war instructor, he is applying lessons learned through hard experience. When accuracy rates improve because a marksman has found the optimal position for a specific engagement, regardless of how unconventional that position might be, we're seeing the legacy of those Winter War innovations. The men who fought in the Winter War, both Finnish and Soviet, probably didn't realize they were participating in a revolution in military tactics. They were simply trying to survive and complete their missions under incredibly harsh conditions. But their experiences, and particularly the Soviet willingness to learn from a smaller, nominally weaker opponent, created knowledge that has saved lives and won battles for more than 8 decades. The frozen forests of Finland in winter 1939 through 40 became a crucible where old ideas of warfare were tested and found wanting. In their place, new concepts emerged. Concepts of flexibility, adaptability, and creative problem-solving. Concepts that recognize that the best position isn't necessarily the one that looks right in a training manual, but the one that works for the specific terrain, situation, and opponent you face. And so, the answer to why Finnish snipers taught the Soviets to fight upside down isn't really about any specific position or technique. It's about a fundamental shift in how militaries thought about marksmanship and tactical positioning. The Finns demonstrated that unconventional could be devastatingly effective. The Soviets learned that lesson, adapted it, and passed it on. And the world of military tactics was forever changed by what happened in those frozen forests so many years ago.